Hey guys, Josh here, and today we're going to be comparing a gimbal to a Glidecam. Now this is probably the most asked question I get every day. What is better, using a manual stabilizer like this one here, or using a gimbal? Now there are a lot of factors that go into play when deciding whether to get a Glidecam or a gimbal. And I promise you, by the end of this video, I'm not gonna be biased or just be like, hey, get this and get this. I'm gonna give you a straight up answer. This is better than that. All right, so first off, a manual stabilizer is all about being manual. No batteries, no electronic components, no nothing. You do all of the work, and that goes from the balancing process to actually operating it. Using a manual stabilizer requires a much longer, much larger learning curve than on a gimbal, because there's just so many different things you have to learn, such as tilting, panning, and just operating it. It even depends on how you hold the handle on the stabilizer too. Now, just like a gimbal, you do have to use the ninja walk to get the smoothest footage, which means elbows tucked in, knees slightly bent, and heel to toe walking. Now, when it comes down to setup, I did mention that everything is manual, so you have to balance it from scratch, meaning that you have to add weights, you have to adjust the height of the gimbal, and you have to adjust the base plate on the top of the system. And on top of that, I do strongly recommend using a quick release system, which makes balancing slightly easier. Now, one of the biggest issues I've always had with manual stabilizers was if I wanted to change my focal length on my lens, then the whole system would go out of whack, because remember, we're using balance here and weights. So once you actually make your camera more front heavy, then the whole system is gonna wanna tilt forward. On a gimbal, we don't have that issue, especially with the newer age gimbals such as the Zhiyun Crane 3, Weeble Lab, and so on and so forth. We have electronic components that actually determine whether or not there needs to be more torque added to those motors. So ideally, you do not have to rebalance on a gimbal when you're zooming in or zooming out. Now, let's say you're showing up to a gig and you want to get a quick shot. I guarantee you that setting up your gimbal is going to take a lot less time than setting up a manual stabilizer. Now, when it comes down to getting shots, I will tell you right now that getting shots on a gimbal is a lot smoother and much more accurate than on a manual stabilizer. But a manual stabilizer does look more organic. It's more fluid with its movements, such as tilts and pans, and it doesn't have any of those abrupt movements whenever you're doing sharp turns. However, it does take much more practice when using a manual stabilizer when you're tilting and you're panning. You have to use what is called the tapping method. So one hand will be placed on your handle and one hand will constantly be tapping on the gimbal to make those pans and those tilts. So keep that in mind. It does take a lot of practice to do so. Now on a gimbal, all we have to do is just turn it, and we get those smooth pans and those smooth tilts. Now, comparing a gimbal side by side to a manual stabilizer, I shot this footage both at 16mm and at 35mm. You can see how the manual stabilizer is slightly better at panning, but overall stabilization is much better on the gimbal. We see less of my body's movements in the footage, and that's because the gimbal is constantly using its sensors to eliminate as much shakiness as possible. With a Glidecam, you're gonna have a much harder time. You are the computer. You are supposed to learn your movements and learn how you're going to walk and compensate for any of those potential shaky shots. Now, another major benefit on a gimbal is that you can easily attach a follow focus and easily attach other accessories such as lights, microphones, and so on. On a stabilizer like the Glidecam or any other manual stabilizer, it's going to be a lot more difficult to attach those accessories. When it comes to specialty shots, for example, when using the roll axis, well, it was so much easier to do it on a gimbal rather than on a Glidecam, simply because it takes a lot more time and practice to get better control of the manual stabilizer when doing this kind of shot. Now, when it comes down to getting low angle shots, obviously Everything is gonna be so much easier on a gimbal because you don't have to rebalance when you flip over your system. Now, for example, a Glidecam like this, when you flip over your system, it's only balanced to be an upright. So when you flip it over, you are going to have to rebalance it so it can balance when it's upside down. So that means you might have to slightly adjust the actual gimbal, the weights, the actual telescopic post here, and you will probably even have to rebalance the top part as well. So a lot of things go into play when you flip this thing upside down, even in post-production, because you are going to have to flip your footage upside down, because when the camera's upside down, so is the footage. When using a gimbal, your camera remains upright when you are filming low angle or in inverted mode. When it comes down to properly balancing your system, it's much more important to do so on your manual stabilizer, because if it's not properly balanced, the shots just won't come out. On a gimbal, you don't have to be as accurate because we have computers that automatically adjust the torque to each axis and motor. Overall, the biggest issue I think people are having with their stabilizers, both electronic and manual, is how to properly balance their systems. Do a lot of research, practice, practice, practice. But overall, I am going to stick with my gimbal from now on, and I think you should too. All right, guys, I'll see you in the next video. Peace.